Let's kick things off with a massive question, one that's fundamental for more than 1 billion people on this planet. Are we all equal before God? In so many traditions, the answer is a resounding yes. It's this core belief in a deep spiritual equality. But what happens when that spiritual idea comes down to earth and meets the law? Well, that's when a much more complicated question pops up. Are all people equal before God's law? And that question right there is the critical point of tension we are diving into today. You see, this is not some dusty theological puzzle. It is a live, global debate happening right now, and it's got enormous real-world consequences. We're talking about everything from international law and human rights to the actual future and direction of the Islamic moral tradition itself. So to really get a handle on this whole debate, we first have to look at what seems like a fundamental contradiction, a real clash between core beliefs and what's happening on the ground legally. This slide just lays out the conflict perfectly. On one side, you've got this core Islamic belief that all believers are equal. Simple enough. But on the other side, a really stark legal reality. When the UN introduced its big convention on women's rights, you might know it as CEDAW, many Muslim-majority countries signed on, but with what they called Islamic reservations. They basically said, whoa, hold on, some parts of this treaty contradict Sharia, or Islamic law, so we're not going to be bound by those. So that begs the question, right? What exactly is this understanding of Sharia that's being put above international law? Let's take a look at the traditional viewpoint that's backing up these legal challenges. Okay, so in this traditional view, Sharia isn't just a set of laws, it's seen as divine law. The key words here are fixed, unchangeable, and transcendent. The idea is that it comes directly from God, which means it stands above any law made by humans. And if that's the case, it's pretty much beyond question or reform. And this isn't just abstract legal theory. This interpretation has very, very real and often devastating consequences. I mean, reports from huge organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch point to laws rooted in this exact view. Things like male guardianship in Saudi Arabia, where a woman often needs a man's permission to marry, restrictions on travel in Yemen, and even these unbelievable laws in places like Algeria and Iraq that have allowed rapists to get off the hook by marrying their victims. But here's where the debate gets really interesting. What if that foundational idea that Sharia is a fixed divine law is being challenged? And not from the outside, but from within Islam itself. This brings us to a really powerful counter-argument, the idea that this whole body of law is in fact a human construction. Now this slide, this is key. It gets right to the heart of the reformist argument by drawing a super sharp line between two concepts. On the left, you've got Sharia. Now that word only shows up once in the Quran, and it means something like a path to salvation. It's the divine ideal. But on the right, you see fiqh. That is the massive body of legal rulings created by human scholars over hundreds of years. It's the human understanding of that divine path, and because it's human, it's fallible and totally a product of its time. And to really drive that point home, get this number, 5%. What's that about? Well, out of more than 6,200 verses in the Quran, only about 350 of them, just 5%, are actually dedicated to legal matters. The vast, vast majority is about moral and spiritual guidance, not a detailed legal code. And this very human process of creating fiqh didn't just happen overnight. It was this slow, gradual build that started way back in the 8th and 9th centuries. After the time of the Prophet Muhammad, after divine revelation had ended. Jurists were just trying to answer new questions for a growing community, using their own human reason to figure it all out. And here it is. This is the absolute crux of the argument. This centuries-long process of interpretation, this building of fiqh, was almost completely dominated by one group, men. These were brilliant scholars, for sure, but they were also men interpreting scripture through the cultural and social filters of their own time, which just so happened to be the patriarchal societies of 8th and 9th century Arabia. All of this has sparked an incredibly powerful movement today, and it's being led by Islamic female theorists. And what's so important is that they're arguing for reform not from the outside looking in, but from deep within the tradition itself. They're reclaiming the word. Just listen to this quote from the Islamic theorist Rifat Hassan. It totally captures what they're saying. They argue that the problem isn't the scripture, the problem is how it's been read for centuries. The Quran, they insist, actually affirms equality, loud and clear. So what this all boils down to is a critical difference between the divine text and the human commentary on that text.
This quote just nails it. A man's interpretation of the Quran is not the same thing as the Quran itself. To confuse those two, these scholars say, is the fundamental mistake.
So what's the path forward? Well, these theorists lay out a pretty clear three-step approach. First, you have to actively go in and reject all the old patriarchal assumptions that were read into the text. Second, bring the focus back to what they see as the core message, a just and merciful God. And third, and this is the big one, assert that women have an equal and inherent right to interpret scripture for themselves. Now, I know this can all seem like a really high-level academic debate about theology and history, but believe me, its impact couldn't be more real or more urgent. I mean, the human cost of these interpretations is just staggering. Just look at Afghanistan, where the Taliban's reading of Islamic law has slammed the door on education for girls, or Iran, where certain interpretations of modesty have led to violent crackdowns. And all across the globe, these interpretations deeply affect the most fundamental rights of women. We're talking marriage, divorce, inheritance, and custody of their kids. So let's be perfectly clear about this. This is not just an academic discussion. When you think about things like so-called honor killings or the fact that the Taliban's rule has been called a crime against humanity, you realize really fast that the question of who gets to interpret scripture has immediate life and death consequences. And that brings everything full circle, back to a final, really important question. If we accept the premise that these laws are, in fact, the product of centuries of human interpretation, then the most pressing question for today has to be, whose interpretation deserves to be heard now? Thanks for joining me.